I believe I'm wired for sound now. Mostly people would like to wire me for silence, but anyway, we're on. Thanks very much, Paul, for the welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to be back with you, to share with you. I'll do the advertising first, and it'll be a part of a clarification. For some of you, I'm the Executive Director of LeaDev-Langham. LeaDev-Langham is a collaborative organisation. We are a national organisation, but you have to be based somewhere, and for good or ill, that's based north of the Bombays, although I'm a boy from the Manawatu. The mission of LeaDev-Langham is to support the training of young Christian leaders, pastors, Bible teachers, translators, church planters, indigenous missionaries throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East and North Africa. The area that John Stott, the founder of Langham Partnership, which is where the Langham part comes in, called the majority world. The majority world is where, of course, most of the people live. It's where actually now most of the Christians live. 65–70% of the world's Christians now live in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. And it's overwhelmingly when the majority of people who are becoming Christians are living. Today, it is likely that somewhere around 150,000 people today will become believers in Jesus Christ. The world Christian movement is growing and growing dramatically. We who live in the West think of Christianity in decline, and our media and our census figures, and this is right across the Western world, Europe, North America, Australasia, the Christian church is in decline, largely because nominal Christianity is in decline. There was a time, many of us who are old people will remember when the culture was nominally Christian, and everybody ticked one Christian box or another, even if they were, not C of E, but C and E, Christmas and Easter, or whether or not they even never went to church, they would often tick a Christian box. And I believe actually in New Zealand that our census figures showing a decline in Christian adherence is largely the collapse of nominal Christianity, that actually there may be some decline in church attendance in some places, but there is actually growth in church attendance elsewhere. But in the majority world, Christianity is exploding. There is a vast need for many, many more indigenous missionaries who are African, Asian, Latin American, and Middle Easterners. And there is a vast need for pastors and Bible teachers and preachers and disciple makers to be equipped to retain this great harvest. The mission of LeaDev-Langham is to encourage the support of churches and individuals to help engage with the training, in our case, the training agencies in those areas in order to help train. I'm actually here to say thank you. This is my annual thank you Sunday, because some of you may not know, but Rotorua Baptist Church tithes from, I think you tithe from your general offering. Is that how it works? You tithe from your general offering in order to make a quarterly donation to Leadership Development International, the first half of LeaDev-Langham, and I'm very grateful for that. And the particular connection of Rotorua Baptist Church is actually with the country of Myanmar and a training agency there that runs under its name, MEGS. And some of you will have met the founding principal, Ong Mung, whom I call Saint Ong of Yangon, because nobody has met a saint like him. But your connection with MEGS is in fact much closer than that. If I can draw attention to Bron Sheck, Bronwyn is now the coordinator for an annual English summer school that is run at MEGS. because the language of instruction at Next is in English, and every student who is accepted by the school must go through a 12-week intensive full-time English program, and Bron coordinates the whole program. We need to send anywhere from 9 to 12, or in some years we've had to send 15 teachers, and Bron also leads one of those teams and teaches. And at this stage I should say thank you also to Terry, because obviously Terry has to let her go, and between them they have to pick up the tab, because Bron's contribution is a self-funding, sacrificial, voluntary contribution. So that's why I'm here. I'm here to say thank you, and I will preach the word. But I do want to say that today my focus is not on Myanmar. Because of what's happening in the Middle East, our focus today is on, and it's integral to what I want to preach, our focus today is on the Middle East and other Muslim majority countries. Because wherever a country has a majority of nominal Muslims, and by the way, although Islam is very, very numerous in numbers counted on a global sense, just as Christianity was, Islam is largely nominal. The vast majority of people who self-identify as Muslims do so on purely cultural grounds. They are not committed to the cause in the way that radical Muslims are. And although it's a slightly different topic, let me just say in passing, you know, in most of the Muslim countries in the world, Muslims will agree and acknowledge that actually the real Muslims are the radicals, because they are the ones who take the Quran seriously, who follow Muhammad most zealously, who follow the teachings most closely. And although the vast majority of Muslims don't want to live like that, don't want to engage in that, they recognize that it's the radicals who are the true Muslims. And of course, that is not the message that we get from our Western media and get from the United States. President Obama is at pains to try to say that ISIS is not Islamic, that ISIS is some perverted, deviant, he calls it a death cult. You need to know from Muslims that ISIS is regarded by many of them as the truly Islamic movement. Moving along. So today, our focus and the focus of my illustrations will be on what's happening to Christians in light of the radical Islamic movements of our own day. But there is something, this is not a lecture about Islam. I actually want to draw your attention to Matthew's Gospel. Oh, the last part of my version it is. There is a display stand out the front there. We have 3 stories in printed form on the table. One is a Langham preaching story from Pakistan. One is a leadership development story from Pakistan, and another one from Indonesia. And the third one, which is very current, is a ministry that we are supporting, a humanitarian ministry of a Christian woman whom we do not name by her own name, who is a Syrian living in Lebanon, who is ministering to refugees from ISIS, Syrian refugees from ISIS in Lebanon. Lebanon is a country of only 4 million people. There are between 1 and 2 million Syrian refugees living in Lebanon. Lebanon is overrun with refugees from ISIS. These refugees are almost exclusively women and children, because the men are all dead or fighting. They are predominantly Muslim. There are many Christian refugees, and Christianity, it is no question that ISIS and other Islamic radical movements are trying to cleanse the very cradle of Christianity, actually rid all Christians from what is the very cradle of Christianity. But there are many, and the Christian church in Lebanon is doing some work to help some of the Christians. Sadly, the Christian church at large in Lebanon is paying very little attention to Muslim refugees, partly because they're Muslim and partly because they are Syrian. Because the Lebanese, although they live right next door to Syria, tend to hate Syrians. But here we have a Christian woman who's putting her very life on the line, reaching out to Muslim refugees, young women and children. And she has led so many of them to the Lord. There is now a small worshipping congregation in a Christian village in the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, Syrian-speaking, entirely Muslim background believers who have been led to the Lord by this woman who is caring, who is doing humanitarian work in the name of Christ. Her story is also on that table. We'd love you to take a copy of it and read. We also, if you want to relate to us directly, you have the option, obviously, of contributing to our work through the church. If you want to relate to us directly, if you're not on our sign-up contact list and you'd like to be, I will actually give you, you sign up, I will actually give you a copy of a small book by John Stott on the Bible. Let's turn to the Bible. That's the advertising and the education. Let's turn to the Word of God and what God has to say to us. Because here we meet in peace, in a relative degree of affluence on global terms, in security, in comfort. We are not meeting secretly and we're not in danger of our lives. And yet Jesus is calling us to be disciples, followers, students of Him, and imitators of Him, and identifiers with Him, and people who are loyal to Him, who give Him our allegiance in a way that ought to be costly in one way, shape or form. And I want to talk about that. We may never be called to make the maximum, ultimate sacrifice for the gospel, and there is no greater sacrifice for the gospel that we could make than to give our very lives for the sake of Jesus. We may never be called to make that sacrifice. But there are a whole lot of steps and stages of the cost of discipleship that come before that. And you can be sure that the people who are and have been willing to pay the ultimate price, and in the Middle East, that means being willing to remain true to Christ and not deny Him. And by the way, in your bulletins, and I just refer to it and leave it for you, is this reflection on the Egyptian martyrs who were martyred. And that little publication has been created by the Bible Society in Egypt. A very moving little reflection on those martyrs and who really are the winners in that situation. And I commend that to you for later. In Matthew's Gospel, in every Gospel, there is this saying that unless that disciples, we are called to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Jesus. It's in every Gospel. It's mentioned twice in Matthew. It may be been mentioned twice in John as well, I think, but it's certainly twice in Matthew. It's in every Gospel. And Luke adds that Jesus not only said we must deny ourselves, take up our cross and follow Him, but that it is something that we must consciously do daily. Being a Christian starts with becoming a Christian, but becoming a Christian is the beginning of the journey. It is not the end of the story. Jesus uses this saying in Matthew's Gospel in two incredibly important places. Firstly, in Matthew chapter 10. Now, his whole teaching in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is sending his first group of disciples out on a short-term mission. It's like a practice run. And he gives them some instructions that are pertinent only to that very thing. He starts off by saying, don't go to the Gentiles, just enter. Only don't go to the Samaritans, just go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But we know that that is not the commission to God's church, to the body of Christ. That by the end of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is saying, go into all the world. All authority on heaven and earth is given to me. Go and make disciples of every people group, every nation, every language group, every ethnic group, every social group, everybody. But he says, and most shocking, and particularly this will resonate with people in this room, especially because we live in a high proportion of Maori, and those of you who are Maori, Jesus says this, and I'm commenting on that because of the importance of whānau, not only in Maori culture, but in all clan-based cultures, extended family, whānau-based cultures around the world, of which the Jews were one. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 10, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves a son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. He's done that having talked about the gospel is a very divisive message. The gospel is designed to bring people together who believe it. But the gospel itself is a very controversial message. The gospel itself is a very confrontational message. The gospel, of course, yes, is a message of the love of God shown through Christ to reconcile the world to himself. The offer is universal, but the benefits are exclusively offered to those who respond. And then Jesus uses that same saying over in Matthew 16, where he has been talking about his own imminent death, the sufferings that he, as the Messiah, will go through, and he talks about how he must die, be killed, and on the third day raised to life. And Peter takes him aside and says, heck no, that won't happen. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And then he says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for you to gain the whole world and yet forfeit your own soul? What can you give in exchange for your soul? And so in Matthew's Gospel, in the teaching of Jesus, we find this concept of having to deny ourselves, take up our cross and follow Jesus is of the essence of discipleship as much as it is of the essence of mission. And by mission I don't just mean over in those far places that you hear wild exotic stories about. Because we are all sent. Mission is being sent. And we are all sent. We have all been called, and having been called to Christ, we are all sent with a message. Even if that being sent is being sent next door even if it's being sent to talk to somebody in our class in high school or at Polytech, even if it's being sent across the road, even if it's being sent to the next office or the next cubicle to talk to our work associates. We are called as Christians to renounce our own selfishness and self-centeredness and take up the challenge that every one of us is sent with a good news message, a vitally true message that everybody needs to hear, but we know everybody doesn't want to, but it's our role to put it in front of them anyway. And some people pay a price for that. Our price is a pretty low price. Of course, there are people, even today, there will be thousands of people. I've said 150,000 people in the world may become believers today. There will be tens of thousands of people, some of them the same people, who will die today because of Christ. Because of their loyalty, their allegiance, their commitment, their unwillingness to deny. I was sitting with an American couple, as it happened a few weeks ago, older than me, with adult children living somewhere in the Middle East. They wouldn't even tell me privately where. They're a family with young children. They are working in a Middle Eastern majority Muslim country. They are there in their minds in the name of Christ. They are there to witness to Jesus, the Messiah, to Isa al-Masih in Arabic in the Quran. And this elderly woman sat next to me and said, you know, I said to my son, it was the mother of the husband, the son. She said to my son, are you really willing to pay the price for what you're doing? And he said, yes, Mum, I am. And she said to me, but are you willing for that price to be paid by your wife and children, our grandchildren? And he said, my wife and I talked about this, and yes, we are. And with tears in her eyes, and it moves me to tell you the story, she said, okay, you go with our blessing. I have another friend. This is one of the leaders of the Langham ministry. Riyad Kassis is the head of Langham Scholars. Riyad is a Syrian Lebanese. Riyad lives in Lebanon. Riyad is married and he has a 15-year-old daughter. He lives within 40 miles, 40 kilometers, maybe I'll say 40 miles, of ISIS-controlled territory. He lives in a village which it's in Lebanon, but ISIS, of course, is no respecter of current national boundaries. Riyad and his wife have a 15-year-old daughter. And they know what happens to young women who are captured by ISIS. And I've sat in the room a couple of times with him when Riyad has poured out his heart and wept and said, what do we do? To this point in time, he escapes. What would you advise him? You see the cost of allegiance to Jesus, the cost of identifying with Jesus, certainly the cost of witnessing to and for and on behalf of Jesus is a very high cost for some. And in Matthew chapter 10, when Jesus is sending out his disciples to their own people. This is Jewish believers going to Jews. And he says, you will divide people. You will suffer for this. And he gives them all sorts of instructions. And he says the gospel will divide families. And when it divides families and whānau and kapu and iwi, we have to take a stand, not with the family, but with Jesus. And he says this is of the very essence of the gospel, that the gospel is offered universally. The same forgiveness for sin is offered to everyone who will believe it, who will receive it, who will respond to it, who will commit to it, who will live for it, who will die for it. And you see, Jesus' teaching makes it clear that allegiance to Jesus to the very end is of the very essence of being a Christian, but so is this mission of sharing this good news with every person we possibly can. Thank you to Rotorua Baptist Church for your part in helping support what we're doing in Myanmar. But the primary mission of Rotorua Baptist Church, the first mission, if you like, is to be faithful witnesses, loyal identifiers with Jesus in the Rotorua. You see, sharing, spreading, proclaiming the message that we have received is integral to being a Christian. And you see, one of the great dilemmas that believers find in the Middle East, one of the great challenges to them is, do they become secret believers? Do they hide their new allegiance? And it's so easy for you and I to say, well, no, of course not. But many of them know that the moment they identify it, especially when they come from Muslim background, that to identify with Jesus is death. But one thing we do learn from the gospel, and particularly from Matthew here, in Jesus' own life and ministry and his teaching to his disciples, is that there are no such thing as secret believers. There are no such thing as passive believers. There are no such thing as silent believers. We are called, in the very essence of our following of Jesus, to share this gospel message with the people that we meet, that we are sent to. This is living and dying for the gospel. And in this discipleship there are 4 themes in Matthew 10 and 16. And this first is mission. The mission of God is to use all believers to take the gospel to all peoples. The mission of God is to use all of us, all believers, to take the whole gospel to all peoples. And it can't be done without you. You're all part of this mission. Whether it's just in your street, whether it's in Rotorua wide, wherever it is. And we're to do it publicly and privately. Rotorua Baptist Church has a public presence. But we all have an opportunity to share the message of Jesus in many, many ways privately. And then, what what is so controversial in New Zealand, and this is the part of the cost that we have to pay, is you see the gospel is both inclusive and exclusive. And we know that the current reigning philosophy of the day is we are to be all inclusive and non-discriminatory. And the gospel certainly is inclusive. Because as I've already said a couple of times, the gospel is a universal offer. The gospel is available to every people, every race, both genders, all ages, every language group, every ethnic group, every socio-economic group in the world. No human being is outside of the gospel of Jesus. But it's also exclusive because it comes with a condition, and that is that the message be received. And what is so scandalous in New Zealand is that we are arguing, we present, we preach, we proclaim, we share, we witness that there is one truth about Jesus. And this truth about Jesus is not just our truth. It's not just for us and anybody can believe whatever they like and that's their truth. If there is no truth, there is no truth. If something is true, its opposite is not true. And the fundamental premise of the gospel is this is not just our opinion. This is not just something that suits me. It actually doesn't suit us. Because it goes against the grain. This is true in the absolute sense of whether you believe it or not, Jesus Christ is Lord. And then we are calling people, and ourselves, we are calling people not merely to respond to the love of God shown in Christ, to the offer of forgiveness and redemption and reconciliation with God and adoption as children of God. We are calling people to a new life. For them to deny themselves and take up their cross and follow Jesus. And obeying, imitating, identifying with Jesus, being loyal, showing our allegiance to Jesus publicly and privately is part of the deal and part of the cost. And then for some, perhaps for all of us to some degree, but for some the ultimate, of suffering for Jesus. Why this emphasis on suffering for Jesus? It's just right here. It's in the very essence of who Jesus is, because Jesus did not come first as the conquering king. He came as the suffering servant. And suffering for Jesus is first of all because Jesus wasn't popular. His message wasn't popular to his own people in his own day. It won't be popular in ours. And yet it's a message that everybody needs. Jesus suffered, and that was the point in Matthew 16. Jesus is trying to warn his disciples that he is going to ultimately come up against the power structures of his day, and that he will suffer, he will be killed. And his disciples go, woo, hang on, no, surely not. Jesus in many places says, the student is not above the teacher. If they do it to me, they will do it to you. And thus a willingness to sacrifice something for the gospel, to suffer to some degree, and we'll talk about that, it's a barometer of our discipleship. It really shows us how seriously do we take being a Christian. How grateful are we? One of the 5 young American men martyred in South America, I believe it was in the 1950s, which is a very long time ago now. And for those of you who remember the name, and the most famous of those was Jim Elliot. Yeah. And Jim Elliot's widow Elizabeth died just very recently. But the event of Jim Elliot's martyrdom, along with 4 colleagues, I think it was 1955. It is attributed to Jim Elliot one incredible saying. He said, "A person is no fool who gives up what they cannot keep to gain what they cannot lose." A person is no fool to give up what they cannot keep to gain what they cannot lose. And that's so well, it says in our context, what Jesus goes on to say in this, "Take up your cross and follow me." Those people who try to save their lives by their own efforts, they will be the ones who will forfeit them. To try to become wealthy and powerful is ultimately to miss out on the ultimate wealth, the gift of eternal life. And sadly, allegiance to Jesus and loyalty to Him and a loyalty to what the gospel stands for does divide people. You see, we are called to make, and Jesus gets right down to family. Those of you who remember also a long time ago the film Chariots of Fire about Eric Liddell, the Olympian, who found out that one of his semi-finals in his favoured event would be run on a Sunday, and he was a committed Presbyterian, as it happened, Scottish Christian, and he said, "I will not run on Sundays." And you remember that? If those of you who remember the movie, that scene where Eric Liddell is taken into the presence of Edward VIII, Prince Edward, who ultimately abdicated, but taken into the presence of Edward VIII and effectively told, "Tell him he's the king. You're not going to honour the king. He's come here to see you run." And Eric Liddell says he has a higher allegiance than the king. You see, the gospel is not to be identified with nationalism of any kind, because our allegiance is higher than our government. Yes, we are called to be obedient and to be respectful and to pray for our leaders, but our ultimate allegiance is beyond our highest government. And then when it comes right down to our relationships, and this is what is so shocking, I mean, the Jewish people were an extended family, clan-based culture. And Jesus says, the gospel will divide father and son and mother and daughter and brother and sister, because not everybody will respond to it. And if you're going to have your allegiance to me, you have to make ultimately the decision what's going to come first, whānau or Jesus. I'd have to say this was difficult for me when I was a brand new Christian. I did not grow up in a Christian family. My mother was an intentional refugee from religion. She had rebelled in her youth. My father was a very angry, staunch, earnest atheist. On 2 occasions in my early 20s, 23 years of age, 23, 24, I'm trying to share the gospel with my father in our own home, in his home. And on 2 occasions, he told me that if I did not shut up, if I did not stop talking about Jesus, he would punch my lights out. My own father. On both those occasions, something in me said I cannot stop. If I have to take it on the chin, I have to take it on the chin. And on both those occasions, my dad literally ran out of the room. I was separated from my own father by the gospel. As I said earlier, and we close here, we are not all called to become martyrs, but we are all to be witnesses. But there is a very direct connection between being a witness and a martyr. You see, the Greek word for witness, bearing witness to something, being a witness to an event, is the Greek word martus. The reason we have the word in English, martyr, which comes from martus, martyr, somebody who dies for something, is because in the first 300 years of the Christian church after the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus, for the first 300 years, so many Christians were martyred because they were faithful witnesses. That connection was made in it, and that connection is in our language, in English language. To be a witness was to become a martyr. But my call, our call, the call of Jesus to us, to his people, to we who call ourselves disciples this morning is, are you at least prepared to be unpopular? Because you share the gospel? Are you at least prepared to be put up with being called names? God botherers or something less attractive? Are you at least willing to pay the price for being faithful, obedient, loving witnesses to the gospel to your fellow students, neighbours, work associates, people in your area? Are you willing to be excluded from circles within your life? Are you willing to be criticised and verbally abused? Are you willing to be slandered? These are all things that Jesus says come with being Christian. Are you willing to have people actually say untrue, unkind, evil things against you because you've actually told the truth? It's just about reached the point where we should take the name bigot as a badge of honour. Not because we are bigoted, not because we are arrogant, not because we are superior, but because that is how we are perceived for faithfully, lovingly, truthfully, relevantly sharing the gospel. There may yet come a time when we have to be willing to pay the price of falling foul of the law. These sayings in every gospel are an important descriptor of what it means. They're the very essence of being a disciple. That we renounce our selfishness. We are all selfish. We are self-centered. We want what we want, and we want it now on our terms, and being a Christian means laying all that down. And we are to act like condemned people. You see, the only person who carried a cross in the ancient world, the cross being possibly the most evil form of execution possible, and it was done publicly by the Romans. So it was a public scandal. It was a humiliating, undignified, excruciating, agonizing, inhumane, evil way to die. We're to act like people who are dead people walking. Because nothing in that this world has to offer compares with what we have been offered. And so I call you as I close to this kind of discipleship where every day we say we will renounce what we want in favour of the gospel. We will renounce our ambitions in favour of being faithful to Jesus, loyal to Jesus, publicly identified with Jesus, giving our allegiance above all to Jesus. Because that's really the way to live. And I call you to live on Jesus' terms, because only on Jesus' terms do we really live the life eternal. Now we will have the video. It's about 5 minutes, and colleague Paul for the benediction.